An infertile millionaire needed an heir and bought the son of a single mother. But his search for the perfect successor led him straight into a meticulously planned trap. The child he chose was no stranger, and the truth was hidden right before his eyes. Follow this beautiful story and leave a comment. The New York skyline glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Harrison Reed's penthouse office. From his perch on the 78th floor, he could see the entire city that had bent to his will over the decades. Harrison ran his weathered hand across the mahogany desk, a desk where billion-dollar deals had been signed, where empires had been bought and sold. Yet tonight, as the city lights flickered like distant stars, the emptiness inside him grew deeper than the darkness between those lights. "Mr. Reed, your medication," said Grace, his personal assistant, placing a small tray with pills beside. The untouched glass of scotch. Harrison nodded without looking at her. At 68, he had built Reed Enterprises into one of the most powerful conglomerates in America. Real estate, technology, energy. There wasn't an industry his empire hadn't conquered. But the empire had no heir. The doctor called again. Grace continued, her voice carefully measured. "He wants to discuss alternative options." "There are no alternatives," Harrison replied, finally turning his steel-gray eyes toward her. "Science has failed me, Grace. 10 years of treatments, specialists, experimental procedures. The results are always the same." Grace had been with him for 20 years. She knew better than to argue. "Will that be all for tonight, sir?" "Yes. Tell Frank to have the car ready at 8 tomorrow. Board meeting." After she left, Harrison stood and walked to the window. Below him, 8 million lives unfolded. Families returning home, children being tucked into bed, legacies being passed from one generation to the next. He pressed his palm against the cool glass, the most powerful man in New York, perhaps in all of America, and he couldn't accomplish the one thing that mattered most: creating a biological heir to carry on the Reed name. The cancer had seen to that attacking Eleanor before they'd had the chance to start a family. Harrison and Eleanor had delayed having children, both focused on building the company in those early years. "We have time," they'd told each other, until they didn't. She was gone within 6 months of her diagnosis, taking with her the only chance Harrison had at fatherhood. That was 25 years ago, and the hole she left had never filled. Instead, it had mutated into something darker, an obsession with legacy that consumed his every thought. Harrison returned to his desk and picked up the leather folder his investigation team had delivered that morning. Inside was information about potential candidates, children who could potentially become the heir to his fortune. Not just any children. They needed to be malleable, intelligent, without strong family ties. A blank slate he could mold into his own image. He flipped through the dossiers. 3 had been eliminated for various reasons: health concerns, too many extended family members who might interfere, or simply insufficient intellectual potential. But one file caught his attention. "Michael Wilson, age 7, he read aloud. The boy lived in a rundown neighborhood in Brooklyn with a single mother who worked 3 jobs to keep them afloat. No father in the picture, no grandparents, no aunts or uncles. Perfect isolation. The report included observations of the boy: high intelligence, adaptable personality, and most importantly, desperate circumstances. The mother, Amanda Wilson, was behind on rent and facing eviction. She had medical bills she couldn't pay, a car that was breaking down, and a child she could barely feed. Harrison stared at the photograph of the boy. Dark hair, bright eyes. That held a spark of curiosity, even in the grainy surveillance shot. Something about those eyes stirred a memory he couldn't quite grasp. He dismissed the thought. It was time to make his move. The next morning, Harrison dispatched his legal team, armed with his checkbook and an ironclad agreement. The offer would be generous, life-changing money for Amanda Wilson, and a future of unlimited opportunity for her son. Harrison had learned long ago that everyone had a price. For a struggling single mother drowning in poverty, that price would be relatively small compared to the billions at his disposal. "Make it happen," he instructed Walter Simmons, his chief counsel. I want the boy in my home by the end of the week. Harrison, Walter said, using the familiarity their 40-year friendship allowed. Adoption regulations are strict in New York. There are waiting periods, home studies. I don't want to. Hear about obstacles, Walter. I want solutions. Harrison's tone left no room for debate. Use whatever channels necessary. Private adoption, guardianship transfer. Whatever gets the job done fastest, the money is no object. Walter nodded, knowing better than to argue further. And the mother? Pay her enough to start a new life elsewhere, far away from New York. I want a clean break. 3 days later, Walter returned with signed papers. Amanda Wilson had agreed to transfer guardianship of her son to Harrison Reed in exchange for a sum that would solve all her financial problems. The legal documentation was vague enough to bypass normal adoption channels while still giving Harrison full rights over the boy. It wasn't technically illegal, merely a creative navigation of procedural gray areas, the kind of maneuver that Harrison's wealth made possible. She was surprisingly resistant at first, Walter informed him. But when we increased the offer to 7 figures, she reconsidered. As requested, she's agreed to move to the West Coast. Harrison nodded. And the boy? He can be brought here tomorrow. Everything's arranged. That night, Harrison found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, preparing for someone else's arrival. He instructed his household staff to prepare the East Wing bedroom suite, the one with the view of Central Park. He had the kitchen stocked with foods a 7-year-old might enjoy. He even ventured into a high-end toy store on Fifth Avenue, personally selecting educational games and books that would stimulate a young mind. As his driver navigated Manhattan traffic, Harrison felt something unfamiliar stirring within him. Not quite excitement, not quite anxiety, but a strange mixture of both. For the first time since Eleanor's passing, he was taking action to fill the void she had left. Not with love. Harrison had long since abandoned such sentimentality, but with purpose. This boy would be his legacy, the future of everything he had built. Back at his penthouse, Harrison paused before a portrait of Eleanor that hung in his private study. Her gentle smile seemed to hold a question he couldn't answer. "It's not what we planned," he said to the painting, "but it's the only way forward now." The next morning, a nervous-looking boy stepped off the elevator into Harrison's penthouse, clutching a small backpack to his chest. Michael Wilson was smaller than Harrison had expected, with a thin frame that spoke of a childhood without abundance. His hair was neatly combed, and his clothes, likely the best he owned, were clean but worn. "Hello, Michael," Harrison said, standing rigidly in the center of the grand foyer. "Welcome to your new home." The boy looked around, his eyes wide, with wonder at the marble floors, crystal chandeliers and floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the Manhattan skyline. Then his gaze settled on Harrison, studying him with an intensity that was startling in one so young. "You can call me Mr. Reed for now," Harrison continued when the boy remained silent. "I've prepared a room for you. Would you like to see it?" Michael nodded slowly. "Where's my mom?" "She's starting a new life in California," Harrison explained, gesturing for the boy to follow him. "She wanted to make sure you would have opportunities she couldn't provide. Here you'll have the best education, every advantage." As they walked through the sprawling penthouse, Harrison outlined his plans: private tutors, specialized training, introductions to his business from an early age. The boy would learn how to manage wealth, how to wield power, how to carry the Reed name forward when Harrison was gone. "Do you understand what I'm offering you, Michael?" Harrison asked when they reached the boy's new bedroom, a space 3, times the size of the apartment he'd shared with his mother. Michael looked around at the custom furniture, the shelves lined with books and toys, the tablet and laptop on the desk. Then he looked back at Harrison, those piercing eyes seeming to see through the billionaire's carefully constructed facade. "You're lonely," the boy said simply. The words struck Harrison like a physical blow. He had expected fear, perhaps gratitude, maybe even resentment, but not this clear-eyed perception that cut straight to the truth he had denied for decades. "That's an oversimplification," Harrison replied stiffly. "This arrangement is about legacy, about ensuring what I've built continues beyond my lifetime." Michael shrugged, setting his backpack down on the king-sized bed. My mum's lonely too. That's why she cries at night when she thinks I'm sleeping. Harrison felt a flicker of discomfort. Your mother has made her choice. She wanted to give you this opportunity. Can I call her? Eventually. For now, it's better if you focus on settling in. Mrs. Parker, the housekeeper, will help you unpack. Dinner is at 6 o'clock. Harrison turned to leave, then paused at the door. Is there anything you need? The boy hesitated, then reached into his backpack and pulled out a small worn photo. Can I keep this in my room? Harrison reached for the photograph, expecting to see Amanda Wilson, but as his fingers touched the glossy paper, time seemed to stop. The face looking back at him wasn't just Amanda's. It was hauntingly, impossibly familiar in a way that sent a chill down his spine. Where did you get this? He demanded, his voice suddenly harsh. It's my mom, Michael replied, his voice small. She gave it to me so I wouldn't forget her face. But Harrison wasn't seeing Amanda Wilson. He was seeing echoes of a ghost with Eleanor's eyes, Eleanor's smile. The room seemed to tilt beneath his feet, and for the first time in his carefully controlled life, Harrison Reed felt the ground disappearing beneath him. Mr. Reed, are you okay? The boy's voice sounded far away. Harrison steadied himself against the doorframe, his mind racing to make connections that couldn't possibly exist. Yet there they were, staring back at him from a stranger's photograph. The unmistakable features of the woman he had lost, somehow transferred across a generation he'd never known existed. I'm fine, he managed to say, handing the photo back with a trembling hand. Keep it. We'll talk more at dinner. As he walked away, Harrison felt his world shifting beneath him. The emptiness that had driven him to bring this child into his home suddenly felt like an abyss opening wider, threatening to swallow everything he thought he knew. The heir he had sought might be much more than a successor to his empire. He might be the answer to a question Harrison had never thought to ask. The photograph haunted Harrison through a sleepless night. By dawn, he'd convinced himself it was merely a coincidence, a trick of light and shadow, perhaps combined with his own desperate longing for connection to Eleanor. Yet, when he studied Michael across the breakfast table, he couldn't deny the subtle features that seemed eerily familiar, the slight tilt of his eyes, the way his brow furrowed in concentration as he examined his surroundings. Did you sleep well? Harrison asked, maintaining his composure despite the turmoil within. Michael nodded, carefully cutting the pancakes Mrs. Parker had prepared. The bed is really big. You'll get used to it. Harrison sipped his coffee, watching the boy over the rim of his cup. Today we'll get you measured for a proper wardrobe. You'll need appropriate attire for your new life. What happened to my old clothes? They've been donated, Harrison replied dismissively. You won't need them anymore. Michael set down his fork, his small face suddenly serious. When can I talk to my mom? The question hung between them, loaded with implications Harrison wasn't prepared to address. Soon. She's getting settled in California. Now after breakfast, Grace will show you the rest of the penthouse. This afternoon, your tutor will arrive to assess your educational needs. Harrison left for his office shortly after, leaving Michael in Grace's capable hands. As his driver navigated through Manhattan traffic, Harrison made a call he'd been contemplating since seeing that photograph. Diane, it's Harrison Reed. I need you to investigate someone, discreetly. Diane Morris had been his head of security. For 15 years, a former FBI agent with a talent for finding information others couldn't. Amanda Wilson, currently relocating to California from Brooklyn. I need everything: background, family history, medical records, particularly any connection she might have to Eleanor. Eleanor? Diane's surprise was evident even through the phone. Your late wife? Just find what you can. And Diane? This stays between us. Throughout the day, Harrison struggled to focus on business matters. The Reed Tower boardroom, usually a place where he exercised absolute control, felt foreign. As executives presented quarterly reports, his mind kept drifting to the boy now living in his home and the impossible connection he might represent. Harrison? Walter's voice broke through his thoughts. The board is waiting for your decision on the Seattle acquisition. Harrison glanced around the table, noting the expectant faces of his executive team. He'd built this company from nothing, surrounded himself with the sharpest minds in business, yet none of them knew the turmoil beneath his carefully maintained exterior. Proceed as planned, he said finally. But negotiate harder on the intellectual property rights. They're overvaluing their patents. When Harrison returned home that evening, he found Michael in the library with his new tutor, Dr. Matthews, a distinguished older gentleman with decades of experience educating the children of New York's elite. Mr. Reed, Dr. Matthews greeted him, rising from his chair. I'm pleased to report that young Michael shows exceptional aptitude, particularly in mathematics and logical reasoning. His reading comprehension is also well above grade level. Harrison nodded, unsurprised. He hadn't chosen the boy randomly. That's good to hear. You may go, Dr. Matthews. We'll continue tomorrow. Once they were alone, Harrison sat across from Michael. Did you enjoy your lessons? Michael shrugged. Dr. Matthews talks a lot, but he has cool puzzles. Education is important, Michael. It's the foundation upon which you'll build your future. My future too, eventually. The boy's eyes, so disconcertingly perceptive, studied Harrison's face. Why did you pick me? There are lots of kids without dads. The directness of the question caught Harrison off guard. You showed potential. I need someone capable of learning, of understanding what I've built. But why now? You're old. Why didn't you get a kid before? Harrison felt a flash of irritation at the child's bluntness, followed by an unexpected urge to answer honestly. I had a wife once, Eleanor. We were going to have children together, but she became ill. After she was gone, I focused on building my company instead. Michael seemed to consider this, so you were sad. It wasn't about emotion, Harrison replied stiffly. It was about priorities. The boy didn't argue, but his expression suggested he wasn't convinced. Harrison was saved from further conversation by the arrival of Grace, announcing that dinner was ready. Later that night, after Michael had gone to bed, Harrison's secure phone line rang. Diane Morris was calling with preliminary findings. It's unusual, Harrison, she began without preamble. Amanda Wilson's background is surprisingly difficult to trace. Her records before 10 years ago are sparse, almost as if she appeared out of nowhere. What does that mean? It could mean several things: witness protection, identity change, or simply poor record keeping. But there's something else. I found her medical records from when Michael was born. The father's information is listed as unknown, but there's a note in her file about a special observer during the delivery. Special observer? Yes, a Dr. James Whitaker. Does that name mean anything to you? Harrison felt the blood drain from his face. Dr. James Whitaker had been Eleanor's oncologist. Are you certain? Positive. I'm still digging, but I thought you should know immediately. After ending the call, Harrison went to his study and unlocked a hidden safe behind Eleanor's portrait. From it, he retrieved a small box containing personal items he'd kept from her final days: a journal, a lock of her hair, and a stack of medical documents. Among them was her last test results, signed by Dr. James Whitaker. Harrison's hands trembled as he examined the signature, comparing it mentally to the name Diane had just shared. It couldn't be coincidence. Somehow Eleanor's doctor had been present at the birth of a child whose mother now bore an uncanny resemblance to Eleanor herself. The next morning, Harrison made arrangements to visit Dr. Whitaker. The oncologist had retired 5 years earlier, settling in a comfortable brownstone in the Upper West Side. Harrison hadn't spoken to him since Eleanor's funeral, where the doctor had offered condolences that now seemed hollow in light of these revelations. Mr. Reed, Dr. Whitaker greeted him at the door, surprise evident in his weathered face. This is unexpected. We need to talk, James, Harrison replied, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. About Amanda Wilson and her son. The color drained from Whitaker's face, confirmation enough that Harrison's suspicions weren't unfounded. I don't know what you're... Don't insult my intelligence, Harrison cut him off. You were present when her son was born. The same Son who now lives in my home, the same son who bears a striking resemblance to my late wife. Dr. Whitaker sank into an armchair, suddenly looking every one of his 70-plus years. How did you find him? That's not important. What matters is why you never told me about him. About her. Whitaker's gaze dropped to his hands. I was bound by confidentiality, Harrison, and by promises made. Promises to whom? Harrison demanded, his voice rising. Eleanor died 25 years ago. What possible promise could prevent you from telling me that? He stopped, the impossible thought finally taking shape. That Eleanor had a daughter before she died, Whitaker finished quietly. A daughter you never knew about? The world seemed to tilt beneath Harrison's feet. Fight we. That's not possible. I was with her through every day of her illness. There was no pregnancy, no child. Not during her illness, no. Whitaker's voice was barely above a whisper. Before you were married. Harrison stared at the doctor, memories cascading through his mind. He'd met Eleanor in college. They'd dated for 2 years before marrying. There had been a semester when she'd studied abroad in Europe, a time when their communication had been sporadic, their relationship strained by distance. She never told me, Harrison said, his voice hollow. She planned to, eventually. But then came the diagnosis, and she feared adding that burden to what you were already facing. So my wife had a child, a daughter I never knew about, and that daughter is Amanda Wilson. Yes. The revelation crashed through Harrison's carefully constructed reality. Eleanor had a child before him, a child she'd given up for adoption, a child who had grown up to have a son of her own, which meant Michael wasn't just some random boy Harrison had selected for his potential. He was Eleanor's grandson. Harrison's grandson by marriage, if not by blood. Where has she been all these years? Why come into my orbit now? Dr. Whitaker shook his head. I don't know where Amanda was raised. The adoption was closed, handled through an agency. As for, why now? I doubt she even knows who you are, Harrison. The connection is likely coincidence. But Harrison Reed hadn't built an empire on accepting coincidences. Something about this situation felt orchestrated, as if invisible hands had been guiding events from the shadows. There's more you're not telling me, he pressed, studying the doctor's evasive eyes. Who arranged the adoption? Where are the records? Those questions are beyond my knowledge, Whitaker insisted, though Harrison detected a note of falsehood in his voice. I was only asked to be present at the birth of Eleanor's grandchild as a medical precaution. The family history of cancer. Who asked you to be there? Amanda couldn't have known about you. The doctor's hesitation was brief but telling. Walter arranged it, Walter Simmons. The name hit Harrison like a physical blow. Walter, his oldest friend, his most trusted advisor, the man who had handled all of Harrison's legal affairs for 4 decades. The same man who had arranged the guardianship transfer of Michael just days ago. Walter knew about Eleanor's child all these years. He was the one who handled the adoption paperwork when Eleanor was in Europe. He made sure everything was legal, discreet. Harrison stood abruptly, rage and betrayal coursing through him. Does Amanda know who I am? Does she know I'm the man who was married to her birth mother? I don't believe so. The adoption was closed. She wouldn't have access to that information. As Harrison stormed out of the brownstone, his mind raced with implications. Walter had known about Eleanor's child, had helped arrange the adoption, yet had never breathed a word of it to Harrison. And now, decades later, Walter had helped Harrison obtain guardianship of Michael, again without revealing the connection. This was no coincidence. This was calculated. But to what end? Back at the penthouse, Harrison found Michael in the game room, building an elaborate structure with the magnetic tiles Harrison had purchased. The boy looked up as Harrison entered, his expression brightening. Mr. Reed, look what I made. It's a skyscraper like yours, but better because it has a helicopter pad. Harrison stood frozen in the doorway, seeing the boy in an entirely new light. Not just a potential heir, not just a blank slate to mold, but Eleanor's flesh and blood, the last living connection to the woman he had loved and lost. It's impressive, Michael, he managed to say. his voice thick with emotion he couldn't fully contain. Very creative. "Are you okay? You look weird." Harrison cleared his throat. "I'm fine. I need to ask you about your mother. Did she ever talk about her own parents? Your grandparents?" Michael shook his head. "Mum said she didn't know them. She grew up with different families. Foster care, I think she called it. Of course, an adopted child who had ended up in the system. What had happened to the family that had adopted Eleanor's baby? And why had Amanda Wilson ended up struggling as a single mother in Brooklyn when she could have been raised in comfort, with every advantage? Michael, how would you feel about seeing your mother again? Sooner than we discussed?" The boy's eyes widened. "Really? Can I?" "Perhaps. There are some things I need to understand first." Harrison sat down beside Michael, studying the boy's features that now revealed their true origin. "When we brought you here, your mother signed papers giving me guardianship. Did she explain what that meant?" Michael nodded solemnly. "She said you would take care of me because she couldn't anymore. She said you were very rich and important, and you could give me things she never could." His voice grew smaller. "She cried a lot when she told me. Did she ever mention knowing anything about me before, about my family or my company?" "No. The men in suits came and talked to her for a long time. Then she told me I had to go with them." Harrison frowned. "Did one of those men have white hair and glasses? An older gentleman named Walter?" "Yeah, he gave me candy. He said he knew my mom when she was little, but she didn't seem to remember him." Another lie by omission. Walter had recognized Amanda as Eleanor's daughter, yet had said nothing to either Harrison or Amanda herself about their connection. What game was his old friend playing? As Harrison contemplated his next move, he realized one thing with absolute clarity. The control he had thought he possessed over his company, his legacy, even this arrangement with Michael, had been an illusion. Somewhere along the way, he had become a piece on someone else's chessboard, and it was time to find out who was really moving the pieces. Harrison stood in his private office, staring at the New York skyline as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the city. Behind him, displayed on 3 large monitors, were the results of an investigation that had consumed him for the past week. Employee files, financial records, surveillance reports, all centered around the man he had trusted most, Walter Simmons. The door opened and Diane Morris entered, carrying a sealed envelope. "The final piece you asked for," she said, placing it on his desk. "Amanda Wilson's adoption records. They weren't easy to obtain." "I appreciate your discretion," Harrison replied, not yet turning from the window. "No one else knows about this investigation?" "As requested, I've kept this between us." Diane hesitated. "Harrison, are you sure about confronting Walter directly? If what you suspect is true..." "If what I suspect is true, Walter has orchestrated the most elaborate betrayal imaginable." Harrison finally turned to face her. "But I need to understand why. What could possibly motivate him to hide Eleanor's child from me for all these years, only to bring her son, my grandson, into my life now?" Diane nodded toward the envelope. "Perhaps those records contain your answer." After she left, Harrison opened the envelope with steady hands. Years of high-stakes business deals had taught him to control his emotions, but as he read through the yellowed documents, that control threatened to slip. Eleanor's original adoption paperwork was there, detailing how she had given birth during her semester abroad in Paris. The adoptive parents were listed as Robert and Margaret Lawson of Boston, a respected family with connections to both academia and finance. Harrison searched his memory. The Lawsons weren't familiar, but Boston's elite social circles had some overlap with New York's. He continued reading, finding a death certificate for Robert Lawson dated just 3 years after the adoption. Cancer, the same disease that would later claim Eleanor. A police report followed, detailing Margaret Lawson's fatal car accident 6 months later. Eleanor's daughter had been orphaned twice before her 5th birthday. Further documents showed the child, originally named Catherine Lawson, entering the foster system. The trail went cold for several years until a name change petition appeared. Catherine Lawson to Amanda Wilson, filed by a caseworker when the girl was 16, presumably to give her a fresh start. But the most damning document was the last, a private investigator's report commissioned by Walter Simmons dated 20 years ago. Walter had tracked down Eleanor's daughter shortly after her 18th birthday. He had known where she was all this time. Harrison's phone rang, Walter himself calling, unaware that his decades of deception had been exposed. Harrison let it go to voicemail. The confrontation would come, but not until he had all the pieces. One critical question remained: why had Walter kept Amanda's existence secret from Harrison, only to orchestrate bringing Michael into his life? The answer had to lie in whatever connection existed between Walter and Eleanor, a connection Harrison had never suspected during their marriage. At the penthouse, Harrison found Michael in the library with Dr. Matthews deep in a discussion about ancient civilizations. The boy had thrived over the past week, his natural intelligence flourishing under specialized attention. Watching him, Harrison felt an unfamiliar emotion swelling in his chest, not just pride in a well-chosen successor, but something deeper, more primal. This was Eleanor's blood, her legacy, his family. "Michael," Harrison interrupted the lesson, "if you're finished for the day, I'd like us to have dinner together." Dr. Matthews checked his watch. "We were just concluding, Mr. Reed. Michael has made excellent progress with our historical timeline project." Once the tutor had left, Harrison guided Michael to the dining room, where Mrs. Parker had prepared the boy's favorite meal, roast chicken with mashed potatoes. As they ate, Harrison studied the child across the table, searching for the right approach to the conversation ahead. "Michael, do you know what a family tree is?" The boy nodded, his mouth full of potatoes. He swallowed before answering, already adapting to the manners expected in his new environment. "It shows who's related to who. We made one in school last year, but mine was really small, just me and Mom." "I've been thinking about your mother," Harrison began carefully, "about her life before you were born. Did she ever mention being adopted?" Michael's brow furrowed in concentration. "She told me her parents died when she was little. After that, she lived with lots of different families." He pushed his food around his plate. "Is that what adopted means?" "Not exactly. Being adopted means you're legally made part of a new family," Harrison explained. "Your mother was born to one woman who gave her to another family to raise. That's adoption." "So my mom had two moms?" "In a way, yes. And I've recently discovered something important about her first mother, her birth mother." Harrison took a measured breath. "Her name was Eleanor Reed. She was my wife." Michael stared at him, confusion evident in his young face. "Your wife? But does that mean—" "It means your mother is my wife's daughter, and that makes you my grandson." The words felt strange on Harrison's tongue, foreign yet undeniably right. "But you said your wife died." "She did before you were born, and she never told me she had a child before we met." Harrison leaned forward slightly. "Michael, this means you and I are connected by family. You're not just a boy I chose to live here, you're part of my family, Eleanor's family." Michael seemed to digest this information, his expressive face cycling through confusion, wonder and uncertainty. "Does my mom know?" "I don't believe she does. She was adopted as a baby and never knew who her birth parents were." Harrison hesitated. "I'd like to tell her. Would that be okay with you?" The boy nodded slowly. "Is that why you picked me? Because I'm your grandson?" "No," Harrison admitted. "I didn't know when I brought you here. I only discovered the truth afterward." "So, it was an accident? Like when I found that $5 bill in the park?" Despite the gravity of the situation, Harrison felt his lips twitch toward a smile. "Something like that. A very important accident." After dinner, Harrison helped Michael prepare for bed, a domestic task he'd previously left to Mrs. Parker. As he awkwardly tucked the blankets around the boy, Michael's small hand caught his. "If you're my grandpa, does that mean I can call you Grandpa instead of Mr. Reed?" The question pierced straight through the armor Harrison had built around his heart over decades of isolation. "Yes," he replied, his voice uncharacteristically rough. "Yes, you can call me Grandpa." Once Michael was asleep, Harrison returned. to his study, fortifying himself with a glass of scotch before making the call that would change everything. "Walter," he said when his old friend answered, "I need you to come to the penthouse, now." "Harrison, it's nearly midnight," Walter protested. "I'm aware of the time. This can't wait." 90 minutes later, Walter Simmons stepped off the private elevator into Harrison's foyer. At 72, Walter still maintained the sharp appearance and confident bearing that had served him well as Reed Enterprises' chief counsel for 4 decades. His silver hair was perfectly combed despite the late hour, his suit impeccable. "This must be important to warrant a midnight summons," Walter remarked, following Harrison into the study. "Is this about the Cooper merger? I thought we had until—" "This isn't about business," Harrison interrupted, gesturing for Walter to sit. "It's about Eleanor and her daughter." Walter froze momentarily before lowering himself into the leather chair across from Harrison. His expression gave away nothing, but the slight tightening of his shoulders betrayed his tension. "I'm not sure what you're referring to, Harrison." "Don't," Harrison warned, his voice dangerously soft. "I know everything, Walter. I know Eleanor. Had a daughter during her semester in Paris. I know that daughter was adopted by the Lawsons, who both died when she was young. I know she became Amanda Wilson, Michael's mother." He leaned forward. "And I know you've been tracking her for 20 years without ever telling me." Walter's composure slipped for just a moment before he regained control. "You've been investigating me. Did you really think I wouldn't?" Harrison placed the documents on the table between them. "The question is why, Walter? Why keep Eleanor's daughter secret from me all these years, only to bring her son into my life now? What possible reason could justify such a betrayal?" Walter was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the documents. Finally, he looked up, meeting Harrison's eyes directly. "I made a promise to Eleanor." "A promise?" Harrison repeated incredulously. "To hide her child from me?" "To protect her child," Walter corrected. "Eleanor knew what kind of life Amanda would have if she became part of your world. She knew what happened to people who got caught in your obsession with legacy. That's absurd. I would have welcomed Eleanor's child." "Would you?" Walter challenged. "The way you've welcomed Michael. By removing him from his mother, severing their connection, planning to mold him into your vision of a proper heir." He shook his head. "Eleanor knew you too well, Harrison. She knew once you had control, you would never let go." Harrison fought to maintain his composure, but Walter's words struck too close to the truth. If this promise was so important, why orchestrate bringing Michael to me now? Why not leave them both alone? A strange expression crossed Walter's face, something between resignation and grim satisfaction, because time was running out for all of us. "What does that mean?" Walter sighed, suddenly looking every one of his 72 years. "When Eleanor was dying, she made me promise 2 things: to keep Amanda safely away from your influence, and to ensure that certain information remained secure until it could no longer cause harm." "What information?" Harrison demanded. "Information about the origins of Reed Enterprises, about how you really secured the funding for your first major acquisition." Walter met Harrison's gaze steadily. "Eleanor knew everything, Harrison, about the Westlake deal, about where that money really came from." Harrison felt the blood drain from his face. The Westlake acquisition had been the cornerstone of his empire, a daring takeover that had transformed Reed Enterprises from a modest firm into a powerhouse. No one had ever questioned where the suddenly available capital had come from. "Eleanor had no knowledge of—" "She had proof," Walter interrupted. "Documentation she discovered accidentally when organizing your home office during her illness. She confronted me about it, not you. She didn't want your last months together tainted by what she'd found." Harrison's mind raced. The methods he'd used to secure that crucial funding had been questionable at best, illegal at worst. If that information had become public, especially in today's regulatory environment— "Where is this documentation now?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. "Split into pieces for safety. Eleanor arranged an intricate system. Part of it was entrusted to me. Another part was included in her adoption paperwork for Amanda, paperwork that was sealed until Amanda's 30th birthday, or until you attempted to make contact with her or her children." Understanding dawned with chilling clarity. You knew I was searching for an heir. You manipulated the search to lead me to Michael. Walter nodded. It was inevitable that you'd eventually seek someone to continue your legacy. I made sure that when you did, you'd find the one person who might lead you to question everything else. Why now, after all these years? Because the final piece of Eleanor's arrangement is set to become public next month, on what would have been her 70th birthday. A letter with instructions to open the remaining documentation, filed with a prominent law firm not connected to either of us. Harrison stood, pacing to the window. Below, New York continued its restless nighttime rhythm, unaware of the decades-old secrets unraveling in the penthouse above. What do you want, Walter? Money? Control of the company? Walter laughed humorlessly. If I wanted those things, I could have leveraged this information years ago. No, what I want, what Eleanor wanted, is for you to finally face the truth. About your business, about what you've become, and about the family you never knew you had. And Amanda, what does she know about all this? Nothing yet. She believes she's simply a woman who gave up her son for his better future. She has no idea who you really are to her, or what her birth mother arranged. Harrison turned back to face his oldest friend, seeing him clearly perhaps for the first time. Not just a loyal advisor, but Eleanor's silent guardian, patiently executing her final wishes across decades. I want to meet her, Harrison said finally. Amanda, I want to tell her myself who she is. Walter studied him cautiously. And the documents, what Eleanor knew about Westlake. One step at a time, Harrison replied, his mind already forming a strategy. First, I need to talk to my stepdaughter. The next morning, Harrison made arrangements that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. The corporate jet was prepared for a flight to San Francisco, where Amanda Wilson had relocated, following the guardianship transfer. Michael was ecstatic at the news that they would be visiting his mother, packing his bag with earnest enthusiasm. Will Mom come back with us? He asked as their limousine approached the airport. Harrison gazed down at the boy, his grandson, with a complex mixture of emotions. I don't know, Michael. That will be her decision. As the jet soared westward, Harrison found himself reflecting on Walter's revelations and the choices that had led to this moment. He had built his empire on control, controlling markets, controlling people, controlling outcomes. Yet here he was, flying into a situation whose outcome he couldn't predict, to meet a woman who represented both his greatest loss and his unexpected second chance. For the first time in decades, Harrison Reed was stepping into the unknown, guided not by calculation but by something that felt dangerously close to hope. The San Francisco apartment building was a stark contrast to Harrison's Manhattan penthouse, a modest complex in a neighborhood that was neither poor nor affluent. As the rental car pulled up to the curb, Harrison felt an unfamiliar sensation in his chest, nervousness. Beside him, Michael fidgeted with excitement, his small hands clutching the toy airplane Harrison had bought him during their brief layover. Third floor, apartment 3B, Harrison confirmed, consulting the address on his phone. Are you ready, Michael? The boy nodded eagerly. Do you think Mom will be surprised to see me? I imagine she will, Harrison replied, carefully measuring his words. This meeting would upend Amanda Wilson's understanding of her own history. He needed to proceed with sensitivity he rarely employed in business dealings. The elevator was out of service, so they climbed 2 flights of stairs to reach Amanda's apartment. Harrison had expected to find her in poor circumstances, given the financial struggles that had allegedly motivated her to give up Michael. Yet the building, while simple, was clean and well maintained. He filed this inconsistency away for later consideration. Michael rushed ahead, knocking on the door with childish enthusiasm. Mom, it's me. The door opened, revealing a woman in her early 30s with dark hair pulled back in a casual ponytail. Amanda Wilson bore an even stronger resemblance to Eleanor in person than in photographs. The same intelligent eyes, the same graceful bearing, despite her casual attire of jeans and a simple blouse. Michael? Her voice broke as she dropped to her knees, enveloping the boy in a tight embrace. "Oh my God, Michael, what are you doing here? I thought—" She froze, finally registering Harrison's presence over her son's shoulder. "Mr. Reed, I don't understand." "May we come inside?" Harrison asked, maintaining his composed exterior despite the emotional turbulence within. "There are matters we need to discuss." Amanda reluctantly ushered them into a modest living room furnished with second-hand pieces that nonetheless created a warm, inviting space. Photographs of Amanda and Michael adorned the walls, a visual history of their life together before Harrison's intervention. "Michael, honey, why don't you show me what's in your backpack?" Amanda suggested, clearly wanting a moment to speak with Harrison privately. The boy happily complied, pulling out books and toys to display his new possessions. Amanda led Harrison to the small kitchen alcove, her posture defensive. "This wasn't part of our agreement," she said in a low voice. "The lawyers said clean break, no contact for at least 6 months." "The circumstances have changed," Harrison replied. "There are things about our arrangement, about our connection, that I wasn't aware of when we made our agreement. Things you deserve to know." Amanda's gaze sharpened. "What are you talking about? What connection?" Harrison glanced toward Michael, ensuring he was out of earshot. "It concerns your adoption, your biological parents." Her expression shifted from confusion to shock. "How could you possibly know anything about that?" "Because your biological mother was my wife, Eleanor Reed." The color drained from Amanda's face. She gripped the counter for support, her knuckles whitening. That's not possible. The adoption records were sealed." "They were, but recent events led me to investigate, and the truth came to light." Harrison studied her reaction, searching for any sign that she might have known all along. But her genuine shock couldn't be feigned. "You truly had no idea." "How could I?" Amanda's voice trembled slightly. "I never knew anything about my birth parents except that my mother was very young and studying abroad when she had me." She looked toward Michael, who was happily arranging his new toys on the coffee table. "Are you saying that you're Michael's grandfather?" "By marriage, yes. Eleanor was his biological grandmother." Amanda sank into a kitchen chair, overwhelming emotions playing across her face. "This is why you wanted him. Not because you were looking for any promising child, but because he's family." "No," Harrison corrected her. "I didn't know when I arranged the guardianship transfer. I only discovered our connection afterward." He hesitated before adding, "Though I've since learned that. Others were aware, others who may have deliberately steered me toward Michael." "Who?" "Walter Simmons, my chief counsel. He handled Eleanor's arrangements when she placed you for adoption." Amanda rubbed her temples, struggling to process this cascade of revelations. "This doesn't make sense. Why would your lawyer guide you to adopt Michael without telling you who he really was?" Harrison chose his words carefully. "Walter was protecting certain information. Information Eleanor wanted, preserved until the right time." "Information about what?" Amanda pressed. "About the early days of my company, about methods I employed that would not withstand modern scrutiny." Understanding dawned in Amanda's eyes, Eleanor's eyes. "You're saying she knew something? Something that could hurt you or your business?" "Yes. And somehow I'm connected to this information, me and Michael." Harrison nodded. "Eleanor arranged for certain documents to be held in trust, with their release contingent on various factors, including any attempt by me to contact you or your children." Amanda stood abruptly, anger replacing shock. "So this whole thing, offering me money for Michael, bringing him into your home, it triggered some kind of fail-safe my birth mother set up? Michael and I were just pawns in some decades-old game between you and your dead wife." Harrison flinched at her harsh characterization, though he couldn't deny its essential truth. "The situation is more complex than that." "Is it?" Amanda's voice rose. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you used your wealth and power to separate me from my son without even telling me who you really were. And now you show up with some story about being family." She shook her head in disgust. "What kind of family takes a child away from his mother?" The accusation struck Harrison with unexpected force. Throughout his life, he had justified his actions as necessary means to greater ends. Yet faced with Amanda's raw pain, those justifications felt suddenly hollow. "Mom?" Michael's voice interrupted the tense exchange. He stood in the doorway, his expression worried. "Are you mad?" Amanda immediately softened, kneeling to embrace her son. "No, honey, I'm not mad at you. I'm just surprised by all this." She stroked his hair, the gesture so reminiscent of Eleanor that Harrison had to look away. "I've missed you so much." "I missed you too," Michael replied. "But Grandpa's been nice to me. He got me lots of books and a tutor, and we flew here on a private plane." "Grandpa." Amanda looked up at Harrison, her expression complicated. "I told him the truth yesterday," Harrison explained, "that you're Eleanor's daughter, making him my grandson." Amanda rose, keeping her hand on Michael's shoulder. "Mr. Reed, I think we need to have a more detailed conversation, privately." She turned to her son. "Michael, would you please go to your room, to the bedroom, and watch some TV? The grown-ups need to talk." Once Michael had reluctantly retreated to the bedroom, Amanda faced Harrison with renewed intensity. "What exactly do these documents contain? What was my birth mother trying to protect?" Harrison considered how much to reveal. In the end, the truth seemed the only viable path forward. The funding for Reed Enterprises' first major acquisition came from questionable sources, money that was not entirely clean. "You laundered money," Amanda translated bluntly. "The terminology is imprecise, but essentially yes," Harrison maintained his composure through decades of practice. It was a different era in finance. Those initial transactions provided the foundation for everything that came after. And Eleanor found out? Apparently so, though she never confronted me directly. Instead, she confided in Walter and created this elaborate arrangement. Harrison spread his hands. "I don't know precisely what evidence she gathered or how damaging it might be. Walter has only revealed pieces of the puzzle." Amanda paced the small kitchen, processing this information. "So what happens now? These documents become public. Your company faces a scandal, possibly criminal charges. That's one potential outcome. And to prevent this, you do what? Keep Michael permanently? Buy my silence? What exactly is your play here, Mr. Reed?" The directness of her question, so like Eleanor's unflinching approach to difficult truths, momentarily disarmed him. "I don't know," he admitted, the words unfamiliar on his tongue. "For the first time in my professional life, I don't have a clear strategy." Something in his tone must have conveyed his sincerity, because Amanda's expression softened slightly. "You really didn't know who I was when you arranged to take Michael?" "No, I was searching for a potential heir, someone I could shape to continue my legacy. The search parameters led to Michael. It was only after seeing a photograph of you that I began to suspect a connection to Eleanor." Amanda sat down again, studying him with an intensity that made Harrison feel uncomfortably exposed. "My adoptive parents died when I was very young," she said after a moment. "I barely remember them. After that it was foster homes, one after another, some decent, many not." Her gaze hardened. "Do you know what it's like to grow up knowing no one wants you enough to stay, to never have roots or stability?" Harrison couldn't claim to understand such an experience, and he didn't insult her by pretending. "No," he said simply. "When Michael was born, I promised myself he would never feel that way, that I would always be there no matter what." Her voice cracked slightly. "Then life got harder. I lost my job when the company downsized. Medical bills piled up after Michael's appendectomy. Every month, it got more difficult to keep that promise. And then, my representatives appeared. They're with their offer," Harrison finished. Amanda nodded. $1 million and a fresh start. All I had to do was sign away my son. Bitter regret colored her words. "I told myself it was for his benefit, that he'd have opportunities with you that I could never provide. But the truth is, I was weak. I gave in." "Yet you didn't spend the money," Harrison observed, gesturing to the modest apartment. "This isn't the lifestyle of someone who recently received a 7-figure payment." "I couldn't touch it," Amanda admitted. "Every time I tried, I felt sick, so it sits in the account your lawyers set up, untouched. I got this apartment with what A little savings I had left and found a waitressing job nearby. Harrison absorbed this information, re-evaluating his assumptions about Amanda's character. Not a woman who had sold her child for personal gain, but a desperate mother who believed she was securing her son's future and then couldn't bring herself to benefit from the sacrifice. "I want to propose a new arrangement," he said finally. "One that acknowledges our family connection. I'm listening. Come back to New York with Michael, both of you. I have more than enough space in the penthouse, or I can arrange separate accommodations nearby if you prefer. Michael can continue his advanced education, and you can pursue whatever career or studies interest you with financial support." Amanda's eyebrows rose. "Just like that? We move into your life as what? The long-lost family members? And the incriminating documents? Walter controls part of them. You potentially have access to another part through your adoption records. The final piece is scheduled for release next month. If we work together, perhaps we can contain the situation." "You're still trying to protect your company," Amanda observed. "Even now, that's your priority." Harrison considered her words carefully before responding. "For most of my life, Reed Enterprises has been my only priority. My identity and my company became inseparable long ago." He paused, formulating thoughts he'd never articulated. "But meeting Michael and now you has shifted something. I can't explain it adequately." Amanda studied him skeptically. "You expect me to believe you've had some sudden change of heart? That after decades of ruthless business practices, you're now embracing family values?" "Not suddenly, no. But something has changed." Harrison struggled to express the unfamiliar emotions. "When Eleanor died, I sealed off certain parts of myself. I channeled everything into building my company, convinced that legacy was the only thing that mattered. Now I find myself questioning that conviction." Before Amanda could respond, Michael reappeared in the doorway. "Mom, are we going back to New York with Grandpa, can we?" Amanda looked at her son's hopeful face, then back at Harrison. "We need more time to figure things out, honey. It's complicated." "But you're not mad at Grandpa anymore?" Amanda sighed. "It's not that simple, Michael." "Actually," Harrison interjected, "there's something your mother should see that might help clarify matters." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew an envelope. This was among Eleanor's personal effects. "I found it last night while reviewing old papers." Amanda accepted the envelope cautiously. Inside was a handwritten letter, the paper yellowed with age, the ink slightly faded. As she began to read, Harrison watched her expression transition, from wariness to wonder. "My darling daughter, if you're reading this, it means you've finally found your way to Harrison. I've always believed this day would come, though I won't live to see it. There is so much I want to tell you, about why I couldn't keep you, about how much I've thought of you every day since. But most importantly, I want you to know that giving you up was the most painful decision of my life, made only because I believed it was best for you. At the Temistama, I've arranged certain safeguards to ensure that when you and Harrison finally meet, it will be on equal footing. He is a complicated man, brilliant and driven, but also capable of great love, though he guards that capacity fiercely. My hope is that in finding each other, you both might discover what truly matters beyond wealth and power and control. The documentation I've secured is not meant as punishment, but as leverage, to ensure that Harrison cannot simply absorb you into his world on his terms alone. Use it wisely, not for vengeance, but for balance. Know that you were loved from the moment of your existence. Whatever life has brought you, whatever challenges you've faced, you carry within you my love and my hope for a future where the mistakes of the past need not determine the possibilities of tomorrow. With eternal love. Eleanor Reed, your mother. Amanda looked up from the letter, tears streaming down her face. She thought of me. All that time she thought of me. Harrison nodded, his own emotions threatening to breach the walls he'd maintained for decades. Eleanor loved deeply and completely. It's only now I'm beginning to understand just how completely. Michael approached his mother, placing a small hand on her arm. "Mom, Are you crying because you're sad? Amanda pulled her son close. No, sweetheart. Sometimes people cry when they find something they thought was lost forever. She looked up at Harrison. He has her eyes. I never realized it before, but he has Eleanor's eyes. Yes, Harrison agreed softly. He does. In the days that followed, a new arrangement took shape. Amanda agreed to return to New York with Michael, accepting Harrison's offer of an apartment in the same building as his penthouse, close enough for regular contact, but with boundaries that acknowledged their complicated history. Michael would split time between both homes, continuing his accelerated education while maintaining the mother-son bond that had sustained them both through difficult years. As for the documents that had set these events in motion, Harrison made the most difficult decision of his career. Rather than attempting to suppress Eleanor's evidence, he initiated a controlled disclosure to the SEC, framing it as a voluntary revelation of historical improprieties. The financial penalties would be substantial, and some of Reed Enterprises' early acquisitions would face retroactive restructuring, but the company would survive, albeit smaller and under intensified regulatory scrutiny. Walter Simmons, to Harrison's surprise, supported this approach. Eleanor would have approved, he said during a private meeting in Harrison's study. She never wanted destruction, only accountability. You could have told me the truth years ago, Harrison remarked, not for the first time. Walter shrugged. Would you have listened? The Harrison Reed I've known for 40 years would have used every resource at his disposal to bury the evidence and control the narrative. Harrison couldn't honestly refute this assessment. And now? Now, Walter said, studying his old friend with something like wonder, you seem to be learning that some legacies can't be engineered or controlled. They can only be discovered. On a crisp autumn evening 6 months later, Harrison sat on a bench in Central Park, watching Michael play with other children near the Bethesda fountain. Beside him, Amanda reviewed applications for the graduate psychology program she had decided to pursue, a career choice influenced by her own experiences in the foster system. He's thriving, Harrison observed, as Michael successfully navigated a complex social negotiation over whose turn it was on the climbing structure. Your influence, I think. He has your resilience. Amanda smiled slightly. And your strategic mind. Yesterday, he convinced me to extend his bedtime by presenting a 3-point argument complete with charts. The board would be impressed. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, their relationship having evolved into something neither could have predicted, not quite father and daughter, yet bound by blood and shared purpose. The foundation, board approved your proposal, Harrison said eventually. Funding for foster care reform will be our primary initiative next year. The Eleanor Reed Foundation had been Harrison's idea, a way to channel substantial resources from his personal fortune toward addressing the systemic failures that had affected Amanda's childhood. Though his wealth had diminished following the financial settlements, he remained more than comfortable enough to fund significant social impact. Thank you, Amanda said simply. It's what she would have wanted. Harrison nodded, watching Michael laugh with abandon as he chased after a friend. I spent decades convinced that legacy meant control, controlling my company, controlling who would inherit it, controlling how my name would be remembered. He turned to Amanda, Eleanor's eyes looking back at him from a different face. I was wrong. What does it mean then? Amanda asked. Harrison considered the question, his gaze returning to Michael. This unexpected gift he had neither earned nor deserved, yet had somehow been granted. Legacy is what lives on in others after we're gone. Not just our name or our wealth, but how we've shaped their lives for better or worse. He smiled faintly. Eleanor understood that. She was always wiser than me. As the autumn sun began to set over the Manhattan skyline, Harrison Reed felt a sense of peace that had eluded him throughout his relentless pursuit of power and control. His empire was smaller now, his influence diminished in boardrooms and financial circles. Yet as he watched his grandson race back toward them, face flushed with exertion and joy, Harrison recognized that he had gained something far more valuable than all he had lost. Not the legacy he had pursued, but the one he had needed all along. Michael reached them, breathless with excitement. "Grandpa, Mom, did you see me climb all the way to the top? I was scared at first, but then I just kept going." "We saw," Harrison confirmed, something warm and unfamiliar expanding in his chest. "You did wonderfully. Can we get ice cream before we go home?" Michael asked, his strategic approach to negotiation already evident. Amanda and Harrison exchanged amused glances. "I think that can be arranged," Amanda replied. As they walked together through the gathering dusk, grandmother's son, daughter, and grandson, Harrison reflected on the strange, circuitous path that had led to this moment. The fortune he'd built, the power he'd wielded, the control he'd cherished, none of it had brought him the thing he now valued most: this fragile, imperfect connection to the family he never knew he had. Eleanor, in her final act of love, had given him not just a biological legacy, but a chance at redemption, the opportunity to become a different kind of man than the one who had built an empire at any cost. The paperwork revealing his financial misdeeds had cost him billions, but Harrison now understood it as the price of something beyond value, the truth that had set them all free. Legacy, he had finally learned, wasn't what you left behind. It was who you became along the way. Film de Historia. Dear listeners, we hope you've been moved by Harrison Reed's journey from a man obsessed with control to one who discovered the true meaning of legacy through family. For more emotionally compelling stories that explore the complexities of human relationships, we've prepared a special playlist you can find by clicking to your left. If this story touched your heart, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave a like on this video. Every day, we bring you unique narratives that delve into life's most profound questions and transformations. Don't miss our upcoming content. We have so many more powerful stories to share. We look forward to reading your thoughts in the comments below.